Welcome to 52 Miniatures. My name is Alex, and this video is sponsored by Corvus Belli. This video is a comprehensive walkthrough of how to use oil paints when painting miniatures and models. Throughout this video I'll show you how I use oil paints, when and why, oil washes, weathering, painting with only oils and more. What materials you need and I guess the pros and cons of oil paints. It's a comprehensive video, so please feel free to revisit and use the chapter markers listed below in the description. To explain and display all of this, the best way is obviously to use oil paints on a set of miniatures, and I will do so on these brand new Infinity Next Wave Combined Army Minis. These are a new lot to Infinity and part of a new chapter in the story of the Infinity universe. The Combined Army is traditionally the bad guy alien faction led by an evolved intelligence. That's like alien tech AI that wants to annihilate civilizations in what seems like a very complicated and elaborate way to reach a higher evolutionary plane. Yet now we have human soldiers combined with alien engineering created by a renegade hero from the human AI faction Aleph, meant to protect civilians in the alien sphere and kind of hold the evolved intelligence in check regarding that whole civilization annihilation business. All this very sci-fi looking and great miniatures to use as a demonstration of how to use oil paints. There's a link in the description. Check it out for more details on these human space alien tech warriors. Now, let's start with the basics. Oil paints are simply put different colored pigments mixed with oil to create a paint. Most often linseed oil, but other oils are used as well. A very old method of making paint. One of the major hallmarks of oil paint is that it takes a long time to dry, especially compared to the almost instant drying acrylics we normally use for miniature painting. Because the paint is oil-based, this means the paint is not water-soluble like regular acrylic paint. So you can't use your wet palette, for example, or try to clean a brush with oil paint on in water. Instead, a solvent is used for thinning and brush cleaning. White spirit or turpentine is most common. I always use an odorless version. I'll have a safety/is this dangerous section later on in the video, but for now we keep going with the basics. The most common way to use oil paints in miniature painting is to thin the oil paint with a solvent to make what we call washes. Washes that are applied to an already acrylic painted miniature to enhance shading and contrast, or even stain to create a different look. But why? Why not use regular acrylic washes? Well, this brings us to the major nugget. Two nuggets, actually. The solvent, white spirit, has tremendously low surface tension. So an oil paint mixed with the solvent creates a wash that flows real well and very much tries to find every little crevice. If we have a look at this base from an Infinity Scenic base pack that I've just covered with an acrylic light brown paint. I've got a reddish brown oil wash in my brush, and when brushing over the recess areas, the paint just searches out all those little crevices and recesses. Second nugget, the oil paint is quite erasable. So any mistakes, like dark wash ending up where you don't want it, well, it can be cleaned off. This is simply done by waiting for the wash to settle down until it doesn't look wet anymore, let's say about 15 minutes of waiting, and then go in with a dry Q-tip and rub off the wash that's gotten outside of the recesses. As the Q-tip can't reach into the recesses because of its shape and size, this removal of excess paint outside of the recesses is kind of automatic. And with a white cotton Q-tip, you can easily see how much paint you're removing, and once there's too much paint on the Q-tip, you just grab another one. Moreover, if we look at this second base, the erase feature of oil washes can be used as a great sort of staining and subtractive painting tool. Here, I've covered the entire base with the oil wash rather heavily. First, I rub with a dry Q-tip. This leaves the paint in the recesses as well as smooths out and slightly removes paint on raised areas. If I then go in with a Q-tip just dampened in white spirit and clean off certain areas, I can pretty much completely remove the oil paint in those chosen areas. And in the end, I get darker shadows, gradient stained areas, and brighter raised areas where the paint is completely cleaned off. This last process is probably the most common in miniature painting, especially using a darker wash for grim, dark and gritty paint jobs. You basically get a lot for free here. Good shadows, nice gradients while keeping bright highlights bright. Without a lot of work and honestly, a layer of paint that easily covers up potential previous sloppiness. Now a wash thinned down with even more white spirit to increase flow further also works superbly for more detailed work. I've got this super cute tank. Who wouldn't want a little tank like this in their life? It's painted with just a green prime and then a quick spray of a brighter green with the airbrush, plus a little metallic work on the tracks, literally 5 minutes of work. And you can see how that oil wash just flows superbly into all the lines in the panels. So how do you make an oil wash like this? Well, that at least is the simple part. All you need to do is mix oil paint with white spirit. I'll show my process creating my favorite all-round wash. Might as well drop that recipe in here right now. Because making a dark, good-for-everything wash requires a few more paints than black. Using only black creates a very stark look that I don't think works all that well on most things. If you imagine the base we purposefully stained a bit, well, a stark black shading would not have worked all that well. Instead, my favorite is a mix of warm dark brown or burnt umber, purple and black. This creates a dark, rich plum color that often works as shading on most things. Oil paint can separate a little bit, and sometimes in the tube there is surplus of oil, so before using oil paints I squeeze the paint out on a piece of cardboard. The cardboard soaks up excessive oil. Be wary, however, how long you leave the paint on there. Oil is, after all, the binder that holds the paint together. At times I've found that if I leave the oil paint on a piece of cardboard for a long time, like hours, like using the cardboard as a palette, then the paint will start to separate when mixed with white spirit, resulting in a grainy wash. I mix the paints in a little container and at times double check my color on a piece of white paper. Once I'm satisfied, we're probably in the area of 1 part purple, 2 parts brown and 2 parts black. I mix in white spirit. How much white spirit to add is personal choice, honestly. As I showed earlier, a thicker wash will be more dense in color, so to speak, and a very thin wash will be more transparent but flow excessively. My easy answer to how much white spirit is just to try it on a test mini and see how it flows out. If you want a ballpark of how much to use, try about 10 times white spirit to paint, maybe a bit less. And as you can see, it's easy to make a lot of wash, and depending on what kind of mixture is made, can take a little patience. So my recommendation is not to waste that work. Make a little more than you think you'll need while you're at it, and save the wash in a glass container. This means you can just grab your dark oil wash next time without having to mix anything, and as time goes by you can build up a collection of a few different colored washes. Now let's see how this works on a miniature. Well, almost. I spent quite some time painting up these great Infinity miniatures, prepping them for oil washes, so to speak. Only basic layers, but it still takes a bit of time. I wanted a more classic sci-fi look than the box art and went for a magenta, orange, cyan and white scheme. That's like all the sci-fi colors right there. The magenta I applied with an airbrush over the black prime, so that got a bit of depth straight off, but the rest was just covering layers of base colors. I'm trying to keep things rather bright, as I know the oil washes we will add later on will give me all the shading I need. And this to me is an important consideration, as we will eventually see the oil paint washes will darken and add depth. So I now, before the oil wash, deliberately paint with rather vibrant bright colors to get the most of the end equation. I go in with highlights as well, getting into pastel kind of territory. You know, there's no magical miniature painting technique. YouTube and social media often tries to convince us otherwise. And sure, oil washes will add a certain benefit eventually. We will get a lot of good looks swiftly once we get to that step, but it's not something that will magically transform your process from start to finish. All this basic paint work is still needed. And once you get the hang of the entire process, you'll start to see where you can add shortcuts or what you need to change in the paint jobs to make the end product look better. But at the end of the line, you still need to put in the time to get basic layers of acrylic paint on. And I, at the end of the line, got to this stage. And stepping back, well, it's decently sort of tabletop standard painted minis. And that is kind of the starting point for oil washes. So let's demonstrate the slap on one dark wash on everything technique. Again, probably the most common when it comes to painting full armies and when after that gritty look. I simply brush on the dark wash I made previously on everything. Well, actually everything apart from the orange. We'll get into that in a bit. I let the mini sit for about 15 to 20 minutes, to the point that the oil wash and oil paint no longer looks shiny. Then, as with the bases, I start removing oil paint with a dry Q-tip. This first step removes paint but also smooths everything out nicely. I then lightly moisten a Q-tip in white spirit by lightly dipping it in the white spirit and then soaking up excess of white spirit on a piece of paper. You definitely don't want it wet. A wet Q-tip will start to reactivate the oil paint, and instead of cleaning it off, you'll be smudging around wet paint. With this dampened Q-tip, I just try to remove paint from what I want totally clean, like a lot of the upper parts of the white bits and the edges of things. And once dry, this is the next day, we can see the result. We've got this wonderful dark paint in all the nooks and crannies, making the details just really stand out, without changing the tone of the raised areas. There's a smooth feeling happening, as if there's been some expert painting happening. So the wash does wonders to these sculpts, and the white comes alive in a sort of grungy kind of way. All over success. But who is this tasty fellow on the right? He just looks a bit more controlled, not quite as grim looking. Well, that's the advanced version that we're about to get into. But first, we need to go through the staining and cleaning up process in detail. Can you add oil paints straight onto a miniature, or do they need a varnish first? The answer is yes and no. The amount of staining that occurs by the oil wash depends on what type of shine your paint has. To explain this, I have to do a simple explanation of how paint shine works. A paint with a glossy finish is perceived glossy because on a microscopic level it has a flat, solid, homogeneous surface. When light hits the surface, it bounces off the, let's call it flat surface, like a mirror, and we perceive it as glossy. A matte surface is bumpy or textured. When light hits, it gets confused, doesn't really know where to go, and kind of gets lost. And our eyes perceive the surface as matte. Now, if you imagine the little particles of paint, little specks of pigment, when they get brushed onto a glossy surface, they're easy to wipe off. They've got nothing to hold on to. Whereas on a matte surface, there's all the nice nooks and crannies to hide in. So even if you wipe the surface with, say, a Q-tip, paint will still stick in the texture of the paint. These different surfaces also impact how much you can rub at them without causing damage. A glossy surface is more durable, whereas a matte surface is more delicate as it's easier to rip away at the microtexture. I prepared this experiment to show you the practical effect. I've got pieces of cutaway sprue from the Infinity miniatures. I've primed them grey and then varnished them with different varnishes going from gloss to satin to matte to ultra matte. Adding an oil wash is pretty similar on all sheens. The oil paint flows out slightly better on the gloss and the satin compared to the matte and ultra matte, but only just. Once dry, on the gloss surface, it's possible to clean off all the oil paint. The satin has a slight staining. The matte kind of gets a bit of a pink shine everywhere, i.e. it's stained all over, and the ultra matte is heavily stained. So the conclusion is, if you use a matte paint, like Scale 75 for example, you will get a more prominent staining, whereas a satin paint like Citadel or P3 will get less staining. Now there is a chance you will rub away the acrylic paint when rubbing at the surface with a Q-tip, and more likely so if the paint underneath is a matte paint. This is not because the white spirit dissolves the acrylic paint, it's just because of the friction caused by heavy-handed rubbing. And the more friction the tool you use to wipe off the oil paint, the higher the likelihood that you accidentally rub away paint. So be light-handed with the rubbing. With that said, I have varnished all the miniatures I paint in this video with a satin varnish before adding oil washes. Well, almost. We'll get to that anyway. I like the amount of staining that occurs on this satin surface, and I know sometimes I get a bit heavy-handed with the rubbing, so an extra layer of protective varnish works well for me. Now let's get into part 2 of oil washes, using them a bit more flexibly and creatively. I'm doing this to show you that oil washes is not only about slapping on one thick coat of dark wash. So after all my acrylic layers were in place, I wanted to shade the orange. And this I'm doing straight onto the acrylic paint without any varnish. One of the great things about getting into oil paints and oil washes is you can create the specific shades you need for what you're working on. This is not everyone's cup of tea, having to mix paint all the time, but if you enjoy that kind of stuff, well then you have a lot of different colors at your disposal. I mixed a vibrant warm red mix with white spirit. I don't slap this on everywhere, I only paint this on the parts of the orange I want darkened. After the paint has settled slightly, I go in with a clean brush moistened with white spirit. This acts like a smudgy eraser and is super simple to just smudge the lines between the red paint and no red paint into a smooth gradient. The side of the brush works well to erase anything off of the highlights and edges that I still want the original orange. And the reason for the brush, and not a Q-tip, is because I want more control over this detailed work. And the result is a very tasty shading on the orange, without disturbing or tinting the highlights. And this is the answer to why I didn't add that dark wash to the orange bits of the miniature, as I'd already given it plenty of shading in those areas. I did the same with the skin tones, but with a darker red, mixing my favorite color, purple madder, with some burnt umber. The purple madder has that rich, dark, medieval burgundy color, and the burnt umber is rich in warm brown tones like orange, and the combination is great for shading skin. There's very fine detail on the faces, like some kind of alien tech implants, so not only does this give a richer color to the skin, it also helps distinguish the fine detail. And then, after this oil paint has cured, I varnished the models. I move on to create a set of washes for the rest of the different areas of the model. This is a great tip, varnishing as part of an oil paint workflow. As I varnish over the orange and skin tone shading, that means they're locked in place and will not be dissolved by future layers of white spirit-based paint or rubbed away by future Q-tips. Additionally, if you want to do some oil washes or other oil paint work and then go back to acrylics for, well, let's say some final edge highlights, then that's totally fine too, as long as you varnish in between. Now, I've mixed 2 additional washes to my already existing brown. A grey for the white bits. I wanted a more neutral grey for the white, creating more of a shaded white vibe rather than grimy and stained white vibe. I've mixed a blue wash for all the blue bits because I wanted to retain the blue color more. The dark wash was fine, but I thought a bit more vibrant blue would not be a bad thing. And finally, the dark wash for the leathers and the weapons. I mean, this looks so good on the leather, but I'll be more gentle in my use on it on the magenta, avoiding the larger part of the magenta, focusing instead on the parts where the magenta meets the other colors to create some separation. I also added some to the parts of the orange I thought needed a darker shadow. And after the paint is settled, back to Q-tips, just like before. This, by the way, does not involve any waiting when working on a batch of models like this one. The first one in line will be dry enough once you've finished adding oil wash to the last one in line. And I'd recommend, once a mini is cleaned off, to take a good look for the little strands of Q-tip fibers. There's probably 1 or 2 sticking to the model now somewhere, and it's easier to remove them now rather than when the oil paint fully cures. And with this, our miniatures are done. Oil washes have 2 distinct features. It's a great way to get a particular and, in my eye, distinguished look that can also be exaggerated into grunge territory. But it also helps immensely in bringing out details, especially on miniatures with very high level of detail, like these Infinity miniatures. But unlike acrylic washes that permanently tint everything, with oil washes we can keep the beautiful shading and separation without altering the original acrylic colors. I quickly want to end this section on washes with some quick tips on how we can put oil washes to use in some more technical and creative aspects. My favorite is a white oil wash. Just white paint mixed with white spirit. This is super handy if you want to create a glowing effect, for example. I've got another piece of sprue here as an example. It's primed black. With a rather loaded brush, the white paint flows out very well. And if you add a bit of excess, you get like an aura of thinner white around the deeper crevices. Once this is dry and after a layer of varnish, I can tint it with a thin acrylic ink, changing the color of the white slightly into whatever I wish. The result is a very smooth and pleasing glow effect that is nothing I could have painted this swiftly and simply any other way. Same example, but imagine having a lava base or where you need some other warmer light effect. Same procedure as last time, just changing the color of the acrylic wash to an orange yellow. I think that glow effect is just so convincing and with very little actual brush work involved. Imagine this on a demon you want to look like it's glowing from the inside, or an undead held together by bright magic, or for that matter, the little headlights on the tank I've been showing off. I actually used this on the little glowy screens on my Infinity miniatures, giving them just a quick little glow effect. Very simple, yet works. When tinted with a very diluted ink, I think the effect worked absolutely best on the dinosaur. Again, a small detail, but that just adds that extra sparkle. The fact that we can make opaque washes is a cool thing. So most washes are transparent or contain dark paints that create dark shadows. But if we use white mixed with brighter colors, we can make washes that flows into crevices, yet leave a bright appearance. Just as I showed on the white, but this can be used in many ways. I used a blue opaque wash on my bases. This, when dry, leaves a weird blue dusty feel. Like these minis are in an alien world where there is blue dust blowing around. Of course, for a more natural effect, this could be a light tan color, making it look like dust and sand is blowing around. We've now covered everything I want to say about oil washes. Told you this was going to be a comprehensive video. We're going to touch on painting with only oils as well as weathering with oils, but first I want to talk about some oil paint specifics. Like, what oil paints should you buy? And in that case, what are you buying? But I also want to take a moment and say thank you for making it this far. Please like and subscribe if you appreciate this video. I'm lucky with this one, with Corvus Belli as a sponsor. Thank you for that, Corvus Belli. And I can thus spend the time making this thorough video. But the truth of the matter is that regardless, making videos like these is something that is becoming more and more difficult. Only 10% of my views come from the subscription page. 90% come from YouTube recommendations on the homepage. And frankly, YouTube is not recommending my type of videos. My income from YouTube is roughly $200 to $300 a month, yet this video and others like it take about 3 weeks full-time to make. By supporting on Patreon, you can help out. I'm fully transparent on Patreon. You can see how much money I make every month and deem if that is a good enough monthly wage or not, and I'd appreciate if you check it out. Now, oil paint details. Most commonly, you'll find oil paint in art supply stores or in the art section of hobby and craft stores. Globally, Winsor & Newton, Rembrandt, Schminke, Old Holland, Sennelier and others can be found. Locally, there's often native producers of oil paints, and if you get very nerdy, there's of course high-end and boutique brands. All these cater towards the traditional arts market. In the hobby market, maybe in your local gaming store, you can find AK Interactive's Abteilung 502 oil paints and Scale Color's Flow oil paints. Scale Color also makes pre-mixed oil washes as part of their Soilworks range. Ammo by MIG also makes little pens, kind of, with oil paint in them. Art brand oil paints often come in 2 varieties, a basic range and a more expensive range. Winsor & Newton, for example, have a base range and the artist range. The difference is pretty much that the more expensive ranges use higher quality pigments. Art oil paints are also priced in regards to the cost of the pigment used. Some pigments are cheap materials, other expensive materials. And thus a tube of paint can vary from, say, €10 to €40, just because of the different prices of pigment. Art oil paints are single pigment paints. This is very different from, say, miniature-specific acrylic paints. Single pigment paints only contain one pigment and preserve the nature of the pigment, and thus takes into account that the painter can mix their own paints to create their desired blends. Our hobby miniature paints, well, they're already mixed, not only in different combinations to make lots of colors, but also to ensure that they cover well. And now we get into the slightly advanced stuff. Different pigments cover differently. Some are transparent, some are opaque. If we look at white, for example, it's got this little square on it. It's filled in. That means the paint is opaque. It covers well. This ultramarine, however, is transparent. The little square is not filled in, and that means when thin, it becomes transparent. And this is great news when making oil washes. Often we want transparent paints for washes. They create smoother transitions and look more natural when brushed out. You'll recognize this from regular acrylic washes like Nuln Oil. They're transparent. So when buying paints to make washes, we can pretty much concentrate on using transparent pigments. My all-round dark wash, for example, contains transparent purple, transparent brown, and semi-transparent black. However, if you want a stark effect, something like I did on the blue dust on the bases, then use opaque pigments. Now, this all turned very complicated on you, I know. But a simple way is just to go onto an oil paint producer's website, like Winsor & Newton, and for each paint you can see what it looks like when painted out on a white canvas, and thus how transparent the paint is. This is often also shown in the art store in some manner. Now, so what do you buy then? Well, if you start out with nothing, I'd recommend checking your granny's basement or attic. A lot of people will try oil painting at some point in their life, and there might be tubes of the stuff around. If not, look at getting a cheap beginner's oil set, something to play around with when you're starting out. That said, if you like the process and want to continue, I'd strongly recommend getting paint out of the more expensive ranges, especially if you're into making oil washes. I found that the higher quality paints take heavy dilution of white spirit better. The cheaper options for me, when diluted, start to separate, and the result is a bit more of a grainy texture. Now, in regards to the different prices of pigments, try to just stick to the cheaper ones, unless there is a specific color you absolutely think you need. These are my favorite oil paints for creating washes right now. We have the dark wash combo. Then there's the dark, well, this kind of goes on everything else where the dark wash doesn't work, paints. Then it's always good to have some kind of base primary colors like a blue, a red, and a yellow, and a white. Now, going back to the stuff you can find in your hobby store, predominantly the uptiling paints are created to be used as weathering effects. They're not single pigment, and they're mostly opaque. This is great, as we'll see in the short weathering section to come. The scale model flow paints do extend into having pre-mixed colors, mixed pigments, sort of what we're used to in a regular hobby acrylic, but this is more of a feature if you're actually painting your model with oil paints, not when making washes. So what about drying times? Well, I can't tell you how long your oil paint will dry, but I can give you guidelines. Oil paint does not dry through evaporation like acrylic paint. The process is called oxidative polymerization. Sounds like a good name for one of my sci-fi minis. I won't explain it, you can Google it. But what affects the process is environment. The paint likes warmth, light, and air to cure. I cure my minis on a sort of hot water kind of radiator in front of a window, sometimes with a fan on. If you're painting in a cool, dank, dark basement, well, they're not going to dry. Just take it out of there and let them cure in a warmer and drier place. Paint thickness. As we thin the paint down with white spirit, there is actually very little paint happening, so this dries relatively fast. But thick slabs of oil paint on a canvas, for example, like real thick, well, it can take months or years to fully cure. Pigments. Well, this is the tricky, weird one, but different pigments actually cure differently, so don't expect the exact same drying times for all your mixes of paint. But in general, if I use an oil wash, taking into consideration my environment, I leave my minis overnight and call them dry. When painting with only oils, like actually painting on a miniature with oil paints and not a wash, I leave them for at least 2 days. I don't see this as a hindrance. We set up weird rules sometimes, like waiting for 12 hours for a wash to dry is a nuisance. Well, it is if you plan your painting in the same way as you are working with acrylics. But if you plan for oil paints, well, I do the wash as the last thing, go to bed, and next time I sit down and paint, well, then I'm ready to go. I haven't actually waited. I've just planned differently. And so what brushes do you use? Well, oil paint is not harmful to your brush, but white spirit is, in a sense. Natural hairbrushes can take a bit of a beating, like they've had a bad hair day. Also, if you still have some oil paint residue happening, it's not a great complement to acrylic work. So I keep my oil paint brushes separate from the rest. And to be honest, these are all discarded brushes. None of my oil paint work requires the fine tip the acrylic work does. And most I've used in this video are actually natural hair brushes. But if you're starting out, get 2 or 3 synthetic brushes and keep them separate from your other brushes. I want to note, however, that the constant cleaning of the brush is not a thing when using oil paints. We only do it with acrylics because the paint dries so fast. What I do with oil paints is I actually just wipe the brush off on paper. I never rinse it in white spirit while painting, unless I for some reason need a super clean brush. I just simply wipe. And then by the end of the session, I clean them off in white spirit. So, the dangerous stuff. Oil paint is not harmful, with the exception for certain pigments. Like this yellow, for example. The pigment is based on cadmium, not something you should get into your system by eating or breathing in dry dust. There's other examples of heavy metals such as lead and cobalt, but these pigments can also be found in art acrylic paints. It's nothing special about them being in oil paints. White spirit, however, is harmful. It's also flammable. Now, as a responsible YouTuber, I'll discuss this, but I also want to hand over responsibility to you. Don't only listen to weird people on the internet. Do your own research about the materials you use in your hobby. But also remember that there are discrepancies in recommendations and thus how to interpret safety warnings. Use common sense. White spirit should most importantly not be consumed. You should also take care to limit the amount of fumes you breathe in. I always open a window or two when working with solvents, even though I am in a very well-ventilated area. Even if you use an odorless white spirit like I do, that only removes the smell, not the fumes. Don't leave white spirit or paint mixed with white spirit around the place. Close the lid on the stuff when you're working and clean up when you're done. Take your trash out if you have a lot of white spirit on tissues or whatever. On large projects like weathering terrain and such, I tend to use a respirator with a filter for organic gases because sometimes a lot of white spirit is used. Some people get a headache when exposed to these fumes. Same as many do with plastic cement when gluing plastic miniatures together or when using other solvent-based products. I've not got any good news here apart from working with a respirator on. I've experimented with many different solvent-free products in combination with oil paints and none of them have been optimal. And with that out of the way, we will now look at a few other uses for oil paints. I'll go through these rather swiftly just to introduce them as concepts for you to delve into if you find them interesting. Painting with only oils. It's most possible to paint miniatures using oil paints. The technique is very different to what we're used to with acrylics and requires a bit of rewiring of the brain, but renders very cool looks and is suitable for some specific things. The oil paint needs to be diluted with white spirit to a consistency that reminds us of regular hobby acrylics, about a half and half dilution of paint and solvent. Because we thin down the paint, it doesn't always cover super well. So it's a good idea to sketch out base layers of the colors you're painting in acrylics first. This doesn't have to look good at all, just something to work from. Like I did on this base, some brown, violet, and a dark green. I then paint on rather crude sections of oil paint, starting with the brightest. You need 2 brushes when working, one for application of paint, the second for blending the paint. Neither brush should be cleaned in white spirit while you paint, as that will transform them into erasers. The dry smudging brush should regularly be wiped clean on a piece of tissue. By adding sections at a time, working from bright to dark, the different areas or paint feathered into each other, and we achieve a wonderful, almost blurry look full of gradients, and well, it's just a style difficult to mimic anyway. Also, painting miniatures without stressing about paint curing is a wonderful thing. But apart from the overall awesomeness of this look, is there a practical use in regular miniature painting? I'd say yes, wherever smooth blends are needed. I had 2 miniatures with dark blue-green cloaks, and painting smooth gradients on cloth is just a very tricky thing with acrylics, so I decided to paint these over with oil paints. Again, I start with a bright, add some midtones, blend them together, add some shadows, blend them in, maybe go back and refine the highlights, and very swiftly I have some very smooth, good-looking cloaks that would have been a headache for me to paint any other way. Oil paints can of course be used to paint entire miniatures. I recently painted these Warcrow minis using only oil paints. It's definitely a specific look and I'm still getting used to the method, but it's a lot of fun. The downsides, if we should call them that, is that thicker coats of paint need longer drying times. We're talking days sometimes. One also needs to mix paints. You know, I've got a lot of oil paint, but not that many. Also, be wary that all paint looks different when wet. We don't think of this when using acrylics as they dry so fast. But with oil, well, you might wait for a few days only to realize that the highlights are not as bright as they should be, or that you could have used stronger colors. So yeah, the technique takes some getting used to. Weathering. The benefit of weathering and staining and dirtying down miniatures with oil paints is directly related to the many things we've already discussed previously, and are down to the nature of the paint itself. It takes a long time to dry, so you have a long working time and you can clean the paint off. If we look at just some simple stuff, like adding dirt to this cute tank, I simply slap on some dirt-colored Abteilung oil paint, just straight out of the tube. No finesse, just stippling it on. And then smudge and even it out with a Q-tip. Again, no finesse. And we end up with a dirty-looking tank. There's no brush marks, there's no tidal marks, no real evidence of the painter's hand, just plain and simple dirt. I used this on the feet and lower legs of my miniatures, swiftly creating a natural dirt look, as well as adding some dirt to the bases themselves. I really have to recommend the Abteilung Industrial Earth color. Like streaking grime, it's got that greenish-yellow tint to the brown that seems to stand out in any situation and just very much works as a great, what did I just step in, color. Again, I used the 2-brush approach, one for applying paint and another damp in white spirit for smudging and cleaning. For dirt streaks, oil paints are certainly my favorite. On things like terrain and vehicles, I've got a piece of cardboard terrain here from the Infinity Sand Trap box. I've varnished it and can now go ahead and weather it some more than it already is. Creating streaks is relatively easy. I paint on rust paint, again an opaque Abteilung version, painting on blobs or lines where I want the streaks to start. I wipe my brush off on a piece of paper and then go back in and start pulling down the paint to create streaks. After this, I moisten the brush lightly with white spirit and pull down some thinner streaks. Now if I switch to a transparent paint instead, this green, you can very much see the difference. Instead of solid streaks, we get transparent streaks, with a deeper color where there is more paint and transparent streaks where the paint is thin. All in all, this is only 5 to 10 minutes of work, and it looks great. Now I have to share my very favorite weathering trick for terrain and vehicles. It's called dot filtering. It's a little difficult to master, but so much fun. By adding a multitude of minuscule dots on a flat surface, dots with rather bright primary colors, but it can be altered of course to suit what one is working on, dark or dusty, warm or cool, by changing the paints used. We then get a large brush with quite a bit of white spirit in it and start wiping up and down, gradually streaking out the paint, mixing the paint, and removing the paint. And eventually, you get down to a sort of streaked filter. I unfortunately overdid the brown, should not have added brown, as the blue and yellow and red mixed will make brown, also green and orange, and so on. But the point is you get a covering layer of thin streaks in slight variation of colors that looks very realistic. I did another side with just yellow and blue, and yeah, the options are infinite or infinity. What colors you use, how many dots, how large or small dots, the size of the brush, how much you remove. But play around with this for a bit on things like buildings and other large surfaces, and you'll probably have a lot of fun. This has been a long video. The minis have been painted, the dropship of information has been plentiful. There's of course more to learn about oil paints, but I hope this is a good eye-opener as well as answers most of the initial questions. If you have any unanswered questions, please ask them in my comment section of this video and I'll try my best to answer them. Now to round off, this is a rough checklist of what you might need. Of course, oil paints. And don't get too many to start with. Get a few and see if you like the process first. White spirit. I prefer the odorless kind. Some cardboard, as we've seen, little containers to mix paint in, and I find a glass pipette very handy for distributing the white spirit. Oh, and toothpicks, invaluable and cheap mixing sticks. Also great for dot filtering. Dedicated brushes for your oil work. Start out with cheap synthetics or anything discarded. Sometimes your most ruined brush is the best weathering tool. Lots of kitchen towel type paper as well as Q-tips. In this video I've mainly used the ones that are sort of pointy in one end and flat at the other. They're real nice. You can of course use whatever you prefer to blend and remove paint. Some prefer makeup sponges cut small. But in their original large size, they're great for larger projects, like if you oil wash an entire building or a terrain piece. And finally, some kind of palette to mix on. I use this handy one that fits snugly into my wet palette so that I can put a lid on when not painting. But a spare kitchen tile, not attached to the wall, is great, or a piece of glass with sanded down edges or something. Now we can end by seeing all the miniatures in their final glory. The most work on these miniatures was honestly painting all the base layers with acrylics. All the work with oil paint was swift in comparison. This doesn't always have to be the way, but it's kind of one of the big selling points. Using oil paints is adding a tool to miniature and model painting that is unlike the other tools available. As it's a different tool, it comes with its own manual, but can be a great tool when combined with all the other ones. Usually any tool is capable of doing things the other tools can't do, and that's exactly what oil paints are. I love having them in my toolbox, and I hope this video explains why you should have them too. You should also start considering getting into Infinity. Just saying. Thank you for watching. Bye.